Hey, friends, and welcome to Wednesday night, not quite live with friends. So, tonight I have an elder meeting. So, about the time that you are watching this, if you're watching it live at the normal time, 7 o'clock, I will be in the midst of an elder meeting. But I didn't want to let the week go by without getting into Romans, getting into a list, and touching base. I want to get back into the practice of taking some midweek time and spending it with community. So I will be back actually live next Wednesday. But just note tonight, if you comment, you won't see me make any response because I'm by myself here in my office with no comments, and I'm just going to blow through the material I have. So it'll probably be shorter. I'm going to not respond to any questions, just going to go through everything. And so still, by the time we get done this, it'll probably be, hey, 7:20, maybe 7:25 at the latest. And you'll have some time before you jump back to Bay State Baptist, where Brian Spicer will be back after the whole month of August off. So he'll have a lot to say, I'm sure. So at 7:30, why don't you move over and say hi to Pastor Brian, who's going to be with us the first Sunday of October at Brookridge. So, Brookridge family, we are still in First Thessalonians. We'll be back this Sunday at 10 o'clock. And otherwise, we are here in Romans on Wednesday nights for the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are through August. We're in September, and we'd like to have perspective here at Brookridge as our best friends. We look at other people's bad times to feel better about our times, right? There's nothing like seeing somebody else's bad day to make you feel like your bad day isn't maybe as bad. So I want to give you some perspective. And here we go. This is a person that's really tired, and their feet are going to be really heavy because they just walked through cement. That is a tough day. Here's another one on hold of the DMV because this was their license renewal. I can't believe they got a picture of a chair. That will not work for identifying you in situations where that's needed. Here's a person who dropped their watermelon. I feel like we've seen this picture before, so I'm going to keep going. This picture again, I feel like we've seen before, but gone for 10 minutes and a bee's nest has congregated on your car. That's a lot. Let's see. Again, gone for however many minutes, and a whole bunch of poles falls on your car. That is not going to buff out, sir or ma'am. It is not going to buff out. That is maybe the most destroyed phone I've seen. We've seen a lot of pictures of destroyed phones over the years on Wednesday nights. That is a very destroyed screen. Public service announcement. Don't put suction cups on your forehead. I feel like we've seen that picture too. Again, talking about phone mishaps. This is a bad time when you drop your phone in the toilet. Why do you have your phone out in the bathroom? That's the real question. Hey, again, guess where they left their phone? I'm guessing on the burner. It's a tough one. I don't eat avocado, but if I bought one and everyone was bad, I would be having a bad day like this person. Bunch of rotten avocados. Don't know how long ago. They don't give us that context, but they do look rotten. This person dropped the beads. That is a tough day. There you go. I cooked some pasta and immediately forgot about it for days. That looks more like weeks, not days. Wow. Somebody outside my office is riding a very loud motorcycle. Anyway, bad pasta. That is disgusting. That's like its own science experiment at that point. It's tough when you're in the theater and somebody has their flashlight on the whole time on their phone. We'd hope that the guy above did not know that he had it on the whole time. You would think that they probably wouldn't have been doing that on purpose, but let's be aware of our surroundings. Hey, found my measuring cup, melted to the bottom of my pan. Again, check the dimensions when you order online so you don't get a giant spoon. I know we're going too fast. Farewell and Godspeed. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's the correct. Okay. This is horrific. Walked through a tick nest. Just throw everything away. Throw everything away. This is a bad day when the sole of your shoe falls off. Also, when you're doing something to your eyelashes and they all come off. That's tough. When you run into a sea urchin, no good. This is tough to see, especially if you're watching on your phone, but this is pins all over the carpet. That is just a recipe for disaster. Ugh. I have to fly in a couple weeks. If I get to my seat and it looks like that, I don't even know what I'm going to do. This looks like an older plane, but it's horrific all the same. Went away for 3 months and the fridge dies. That is gross. That's also what happens when the fridge dies. Lots of bad things. That's like an episode of Hoarders where somebody hasn't used their kitchen in like 2 years and they're like, oh, let's go see what's in the freezer. No, not a good idea. Sunscreen was not water resistant. Wow. Yeah, that is a bad burn. This is just bad behavior. Somebody threw their acai bowl at the screen during the movie. Who does it? Like, what is happening to our society where people will just throw their food at the screen in the movie? Not good. Brookings Community Church does not support that kind of behavior. Drop my dinner all over my laptop. That's a tough one. A little hole in the coffee. Now your coffee holder is filled with coffee. That's not good. This is what the tailor did to my new jeans. That does not look right. I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of giving it to the tailor was and what the tailor was supposed to do, but that doesn't look right. Spray paint all over the new laptop. No good. That's tough when you leave your popcorn for a minute and then you find some sort of bug in there. It looks like a beetle. I don't know if that's a cockroach or not, but I don't even really want to spend any more time thinking about it. It's tough when you're scanning your items and then you drop your credit card into the little space in between the scanner and the rest of the counter. That's no good. Bye-bye, credit card. No good when your Vaseline explodes all over your toiletries. No good when you leave a bar of chocolate in your pants and then put it through this looks like the dryer. That's even worse. Hey, looks like somebody fell on their couch. The imprint is there forever. This is horrible. This is someone taking their trash out and the bottom falls out. That is really gross. Not ideal. Really? It's someone drives the car into the pool and that's not ideal? No, that actually is not ideal. So, all set with that. Hey, but let's talk about Romans. Speaking of things that are not ideal, we're going to talk about a verse that often gets quoted to us when things aren't ideal. So, hopefully we can get some encouragement. We've been in Romans 8, right? Which many regard to be the greatest chapter of the Bible. And we want to start talking about one of the most famous verses in that chapter, one of the most famous in the whole Bible, Romans 8:28. So we're going to spend the next 2 weeks talking about Romans 8:28. Maybe you have a t-shirt with those words bedazzled on it, or you've got them on a coffee mug or a pillow. We'd love to quote it when bad things happen. Hey, God's got a plan. All things work together for good. Here's the thing. If you're honest, sometimes that verse feels hollow or frustrating to hear, because while we can sometimes see good coming out of the bad, sometimes we don't see any good coming out of a bad thing or a bad time. During difficult times, people can try to comfort us with verses like Romans 8:1, which we've covered over the last few weeks. There's no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. And while that can give some mental and theological assent and comfort through that verse, it doesn't change our feelings, right? If we feel abandoned by God, if we feel rejected, if we feel cursed, that's not a verse that brings a lot of comfort, but it's more bearable than Romans 8:28. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. How many people have actually felt comforted by that verse? You feel like maybe you've been going through something, maybe the most difficult time of your life, and someone tries to comfort you. You know, God will work all things together for good. You just don't understand. Sometimes you can get angry. Like, what possible good? Where is the silver lining? How is any of this working for good? Have you ever dealt with somebody in this kind of situation, or you've been through this situation yourself? This should resonate with you. Suffering, I don't know if you know this, but suffering is the number one reason that people stop believing in God. Ricky Gervais is an atheist, and people ask him if he ever prays, and his response is no. Why would I ask God to help me find my keys if he stood and did nothing during the Holocaust? There's a lot that goes into that and a lot we could talk about this, but the point is suffering often causes us to pull away from God or to stop believing. So I want to talk about what Romans 8:28 actually means. We're going to do kind of the myths that Christians believe about suffering that this passage corrects, and then we're going to talk about some hope, and then we're going to continue with hope next week. So myth number 1 is if we live well, we can avoid suffering. If we live well, we can avoid suffering. That is a myth. Many Christians believe that if they live like they're supposed to, they can avoid or at least minimize suffering. But notice that Paul assumes in this passage. Now I'm going to quote a few verses that are in this passage. So we're in Romans 8:18 to 30. So please look these verses up. Please read through this passage over the next couple of weeks. I'm not going to show you all these verses on the screen, but trust me on them. Notice that Paul assumes in this passage that suffering is a part of life. In verse 18, he says this present time has sufferings. In verse 23, he talks about groaning underneath the weight of suffering. Verse 21, all of creation is subject and it's to futility and is in bondage to corruption. That's verse 21. Nothing in this passage assumes that if you're a child of God, you avoid these realities. In fact, it says the opposite. Jesus told his disciples, in this world, you will have tribulation. A related assumption many believe in our culture is that life by itself inevitably turns out positively, that the universe is just wired to turn out for good. It's structured so that every dark cloud eventually has a silver lining. It's like the little orphan Annie philosophy. The sun will come out tomorrow. This passage actually indicates the opposite. Creation, Paul says, is in bondage to futility. That's where it's all headed. And it's only through God's special intervention on behalf of believers that anything works out for good. Some translations just read all things work together for good, which you could mistakenly take to mean that they just somehow naturally turn out for good. Like, don't worry, be happy, Hakuna Matata, it is what it is. But the actual Greek makes it clear that God is the only one who works things for good in a world where it's going the opposite direction. It's only through a special act of grace toward believers that God redeems bad circumstances for good. Think about if you go to the beach, that all those tiny grains of sand on the beach used to be part of a great mountain or a big rock. The greatest mountains in creation inevitably dissolve into sand. That's where creation is going. It's going to a state of dissolution. This is where it's all headed. It's in bondage to corruption. So myth number 1 is a myth. If we live well, we can avoid suffering. That's not true. Myth number 2, suffering always points to some sin we need to confess. The idea here is that in suffering, God's always trying to get your attention in order to correct an error or expose some sin that you need to confess. Let me be clear. Sometimes this is true. Affliction is one of God's choice tools to wake us up. The author of Psalm 119 said, before I was afflicted, I went astray. God put Jonah in the belly of the whale to get his attention. Sometimes God puts us flat on our backs, so we'll finally be looking in the right direction. But that is not always the case. And the suffering that Paul talks about here in Romans 8 doesn't appear to be in response to anything wrong. In the book of the Bible that most deals with suffering, the book of Job, God makes clear that Job wasn't suffering because of his sin. God actually calls him the most righteous man alive on earth at the time. Jesus was the most righteous person to ever live, and he suffered. So not all suffering is trying to correct something in you. And if it is, God will quickly let you know what it is. Think about it as parents. When you punish your kids to correct something in them, they should always know what it is they're being punished for. You don't walk into their room, like spank them or take something away from them or enact some sort of discipline. And they're like, why are you doing that, Daddy? And you're like, you figure it out. No, if God sends suffering your way because of sin, he will very quickly make it known to you what that is. If you don't know, there's a very good chance the suffering is not like Jonah's wake-up call. It's more like Job's mysterious suffering. All right, myth number 3. We'll always be able to find the silver linings behind our dark clouds. This is the big one where people use Romans 8:28 wrongly. They're like, well, the Bible says all things work together for good. So where's the silver lining for this one? Sometimes we can see it, right? Maybe a car accident awakens an alcoholic to the severity of his addiction. Maybe a painful breakup sets you up for an even better relationship. And we could say, hey, see, all things work together for good. Sometimes we discover how a painful or confusing chapter of our lives prepared us for something. The great illustration for this is the classic movie, The Karate Kid, right? Daniel-san keeps getting beat up, wants to learn karate so he can defend himself. Mr. Miyagi agrees to teach him, enters him into a karate tournament, and then does the whole wax on, wax off. And he doesn't really figure out why he's having to do all these chores until he actually starts realizing that muscle memory has made him into a karate champion. Sometimes you and I will have our aha moment too, just like Daniel-san did. But sometimes we don't see it. And in this chapter, Paul indicates that much of the good that God brings out of our suffering will be seen only in eternity. In verse 18, he talks about the glory that's going to be revealed. It's not all experienced right now. In verse 25, it says we wait for it with patience. In verse 24, it says we're saved in hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. If you can see it, it's not hope, it's sight. A lot of us say we want to live by faith, but the moment we can't see or understand what God is doing, we throw up our hands and are like, are you even there, God? We want to live by faith, but we also want to be able to understand why every bad thing happens. We want to be able to say, oh, I see, I get it now. But that's not walking by faith. That's walking by sight. Faith means trusting God even when you can't see him. Faith means, Paul is saying here, waiting patiently until the end to experience resolution. It means not declaring a verdict over your life until you experience the glory of eternity. Sometimes you just don't know, and sometimes we just have to keep our mouths shut and wait patiently for what God is doing. Or think of it this way. You ever notice how the best movies create tension that doesn't resolve until the very end? The best book series create tensions that sometimes don't get resolved until later in the series. The best movies and shows have these long arcs. Sometimes things aren't resolved until the very end, and that's often how our lives work. Avoid the temptation to declare that nothing makes sense until you have gotten to God's finale to the whole series. He will make things right in the end. So if these are the myths, now we turn it around and say, all right, what hope does God give me in suffering in Romans 8? So in verse 28, and this is the verse that we're going to look at, here you go. If you don't know it by heart already, here it is. I want you to be able to see it. And we know that all things, for those who love God, and that's very important. And we know that for all things, for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. What is his purpose? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Big deal. We overlooked that last part of verse 28, which might be the most important part. For those who love God, all things work together for good, who are called according to his purpose. What is his purpose? For those he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. God's purpose in all things is to make you more like Jesus. The good that Romans 8 talks about is not so much about giving our lives better circumstances as it is making you a better you, a person like Jesus. At every moment, God is working toward that. That painful chapter in your marriage, the setback at work, the chronic illness, all of it is to the end that God wants to make you more like Jesus. And there will come a time, if you submit to God through faith, when you see that all the painful chapters, all the heartaches, the tears, the disabilities, the disadvantages, the disappointments, even the seasons of boredom and loneliness were used by God for one purpose, to mold you into more like the image of Jesus. So instead of only asking God to get you out of trouble, ask him what you should get out of the trouble. Somewhere, at some time, in some way in eternity, you'll have your moment like Daniel-san did and realize that sand the floor and paint the fence and wax on, wax off moments, we're all teaching you to be like Jesus. So there is hope for us. This world is crumbling. This world was never made to last. What was made to last in eternity was having a relationship with God and allowing him to work in our lives to make him more like Jesus so that we can have an influence on the world, right? Know God, make him known. We value relationships because we believe relationships with God and with us lead to redemption. So redemptive relationships, and we invite people to experience the grace and forgiveness of Jesus and to follow him with us. And we can encourage each other, not by just saying things without meaning. Oh yeah, God will work everything out for good. He will work everything out for good for those who love him. And the purpose is that you become more like Jesus. So you may not ever see it. You may not ever understand it, but we have faith to believe that God will work things for good. And it's only God that can do that. So God's promised to use all things to make you more like Jesus. The second promise of hope, tune in next week and we'll start talking about that. Hope you have a fantastic night. Would love you to jump on over to Bay State at 7:30 and see my buddy, Pastor Brian Spicer. Otherwise, we will see you at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. And I hope you all are doing well. I appreciate you. Glad to be part of this community and family.